Welcome to Disciple Dojo. Today we are talking to a friend of mine who has done something that not a lot of people have done. We're going to be talking with Ellie Wiener, who is over in Cambridge in the UK, and she has memorized in Hebrew the entire book of Job. You may have read an article that she has written about that recently. I'll link it in the video description below. But she's memorized the book of Job because she is doing her PhD in Old Testament, and Job is the focus, or has been the focus, of a lot of her studies. So if there is an expert in the field of Joban studies, it is Ellie. And I met her at SBL last year. We chatted for a bit. We have mutual friends, and I was like, we got to get you on Disciple Dojo. I got questions about Job. Viewers have questions about Job. And I solicited questions from viewers here on YouTube, as well as over on Facebook and on Instagram, saying, hey, we got a Job scholar coming in. What questions would you like to ask? And we got dozens and dozens of questions, really good questions. And I got to ask Ellie some of those. So this is going to be a two-part episode. And the first part is going to be our discussion about the book of Job in general. You know, a very inscrutable, puzzling, hard to get through book. So we're going to have a little primer on the book of Job. And then in the second episode, as a follow-up, Ellie's going to answer. I'm just going to ask her the questions that came in from YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, and she's just going to go through those questions as I ask them. Now, a lot of people had the same questions, so we kind of culled them into one. And then a lot of the questions people asked, she actually answered in the discussion in the first episode. So watch this discussion, and a lot of the questions that you had submitted get answered in that one. But then stay tuned for the second episode, where she specifically takes on those questions in a little bit more of a Q&A form. And Ellie's over in the UK. She's over in Cambridge. So it was funny, as we were talking, you'll see her side of the Zoom screen gets darker and darker and darker. And because when we started the interview, it was afternoon and the sun then set over there. So that's what's going on. If you are like, why is the screen getting darker? Why is she getting blurrier? It's because the sun was setting, and just we didn't want to stop and turn on lights and do all the other stuff. Anyway, it was a great discussion. I'm excited. The reason that we're able to do these kind of long form discussions with just phenomenal biblical scholars, is because of you. Of those of you that subscribe to the channel, that enable notifications, that helps us in the YouTube algorithm, those of you who like the videos, comment, share the videos on your own social media, all that stuff, we don't take it for granted. It is incredibly helpful. But it's not the only way. If you would like to help Disciple Dojo in more tangible ways to continue this ministry, we're a full 501c3 nonprofit. All of this teaching ministry that we do is funded entirely by dojo donors, monthly donors. So if that's something you're interested in, a couple of bucks a month or more, feel free. I'm going to put the link right here. I'll just put it right there, and you can go check out our donor page. Greatly appreciated. We're not begging for money. We're not saying to sow your seed of blessing and God will reward you or any of that stuff. I'm going to get comments now saying, oh, why are you always asking for money? We don't always, but it's the reality of being a nonprofit. We rely on donors. So if you enjoy this ministry, if you appreciate what we're doing for bridging the gap between biblical scholarship and just curious, everyday interested readers, that's a way you can help us continue to do it, is by becoming a monthly dojo donor. Now that it's out of the way, let's talk Job with Ellie Wiener of Cambridge University. Ellie Wiener, welcome to Disciple Dojo.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes. You're coming to us you're not from right down the street. No?
Oh, no. Well, I guess I used to be, maybe, but in my eastward trajectory, I've landed myself across the pond. So currently in England.
Yes. Where in England are you?
I'm in Cambridge, the original Cambridge, for those who might be in Massachusetts, near the newer
Yeah,
one.
Not New England, Cambridge.
No.
Although, where'd you do seminary?
Actually, it was at Gordon Conwell, so not
That's
far from the other Cambridge. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I don't know how I didn't know that when we met. We met back at SBL last year, and it just
Yes.
completely, I don't know if I knew that or not, that you were also a Gordon Conwell person. What year
Yeah.
were you, when were you there?
I was there from 2017, no, 2020.
Okay.
Yes, 2020 until 2022.
Okay.
So I got right in the thick of the COVID era. It was
Yeah.
good fun. I was
Yeah.
actually in Israel studying abroad for seminary when COVID descended on the world. So
Mm,
yeah, it made for an interesting transition into
yeah.
graduate study. But
Yeah, I bet. I bet it made it the logistics were a bit of a challenge.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you end up living on campus at Gordon Conwell?
I did
Okay.
eventually. I lived off campus at first and then moved on campus, which is good
Nice.
fun.
I lived in
So,
Pilgrim Hall. I don't know if it's still there or not,
oh,
but down the
it
down the hill at the bottom,
was. I
above the
don't know.
garage where they keep all the lawnmowers. That was that was my room. That's cool. And so after you finished Gordon Conwell, did you go straight to
Yeah.
Cambridge?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, after a summer in which I went to Kenya, then came to Cambridge. So a
Hmm.
little detour on the way.
It's still
Yeah,
on the way though, so it counts.
yeah, that's right. Still going east.
So you're at Cambridge. What are you
Yes.
studying? What is your official program of study that you're doing?
Yes. So Cambridge will tell me at the end of this that hopefully I have a PhD in theology and religious studies, which to my mind sounds way too generous, given that I'm getting more and more specialized. So I'm within the Old Testament part of the Faculty of Divinity,
Hmm.
and more specifically, having lots of quality time with my friend Job.
Yes, and we're gonna get to
Yeah,
Job because Job is your boy.
that's right.
And we've wanted to have, I've actually, ever since we talked at SBL, I've wanted to have you on. And we'll talk about why in just a minute. But real quick, why Old Testament? Before we get to why Job, why Old Testament? That's not something that a lot of people naturally gravitate to.
Yeah, I would say, I guess it should couch it in a bit of narrative. So I came into undergrad, which I did at a Christian liberal arts institution. So I had lots of option what to study. And at first thought, there's no way in the world I could possibly choose. I'm just an all-out nerd. But I was about a week into my Old Testament survey class that all college freshmen were required to take when I thought, wow, I need more of this.
Mm.
And I think what was going on is that there was this sort of sense of existential urgency that I had to put the Bible together. So I'd grown up in a Christian context, and my biblical literacy was fairly good as they come for an 18-year-old. But I just felt, though I didn't have the language for it at the time, essentially what I needed was to think through hermeneutics, the
Mm.
way one interprets the Bible, the approach you take to reading the Bible well, and also biblical theology. So what I was, I think, encountering in the Old Testament as I started to study in more depth was actually the language and imagery that are capable of making your heart sing. So
Mm.
just to say propositionally that Jesus died for your sins doesn't actually resonate with meaning. Like, what is, why?
Right.
What was that for? Why was that necessary? But actually, when you situate what really is the crashing climax in the New Testament in the context of all of the sort of building melody and harmony throughout the Old Testament. That's, oh man, that really has the capacity to make its way into your imagination and transform your way of living.
Yeah.
So I think at an existential level, that's what was going on. I also had a really, yeah, profound relationship with a mentor in college who was an Old Testament prof.
Mm.
Just, yeah, not only was intellectually inspiring, but just a deep person of integrity and prayerfulness.
Mm.
And so I just followed her to everything she taught. And before you know it, Old Testament nerd.
Yeah.
So,
It's amazing
yeah.
what a profound influence our professors have on us. You know, like it
Yeah.
was for me, it was the same thing. It was people like Gordon Hugenberger and Doug Stewart and Gary Pratico that I had at Gordon Conwell that just they made the Old Testament just fascinating and interesting, and even all the debates, even all the discussions of translation and the ambiguities of the Old Testament that were more than I saw in the New Testament. I just felt like there's a lot more work to be done and ground to cover in the Old Testament that
Yeah.
hasn't been covered, or at least among Christians hasn't been
Yeah.
covered.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty quickly I started to register that vocationally, what this could lead to for me is essentially an effort just to help other people become more endeared to the Old Testament and to feel less scared of it, less
Yes.
sort of repelled instinctively by it, because there are so many degrees of distance
Hmm.
between us and the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I just recognize for myself and then certainly for others, it can feel like a high wall
Sure.
to
Yeah.
just access most parts of the Old Testament.
Yep.
So I'd love, yeah, just to help people
Hmm.
become more exhilarated and less scared,
Yeah,
essentially.
absolutely. That's one of the reasons that I think we're kindred spirits, and I wanted to have you on the
Yeah.
dojo is that's exactly what we try to do, focusing on the old. I've said, and you may agree or disagree, but the image that I use is if you read the New Testament without understanding, some people just say start with the New Testament, start with the Gospel of John, start reading, and you can read it and you can become a Christian, you can get saved, you can learn about Jesus, you can, you propositionally, there's the gospel gives you what you need for salvation, but it's like watching a sporting event like a Super Bowl or World Cup soccer or something on a little tiny black and white TV. Like you can see it, you can watch the game, you can follow the score. But when you have that understanding of the Old Testament and you know the story of Israel and you know the world into which Jesus came, it's like watching that exact same game, but on a super high definition television where you can see all the details and like down to the blades of grass and the sweat on the players' faces. And it's almost like you're watching a completely different thing, but you're not. You're watching the same game, the same score. So for me,
Yeah.
that animates me of wanting to get people back in the Old Testament. It just amplifies
Mm.
the understanding of the New Testament. Is that what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess if I was just thinking, how would I build on your analogy? Because I think there's something also that's really catalyzing. Not to say that this couldn't happen from the New Testament alone, but once you start seeing things in high def and full color, then you're like, I want to get in that game. Like I want to jersey up and start, yeah, participating in this unfolding story.
Yeah.
I think as you look back, you're better equipped to look forward and realize like, oh wow, this entire thing has a trajectory, it has a telos.
Yeah.
And actually now by the power of the spirit, I've been joined into like I've been grafted into the family of Abraham
Hmm.
and I'm part of this, yeah,
Yeah.
unfolding narrative
You're
of
on the
what God
team. You're on the
built.
team.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, so here's the problem. You're reading through
Mm.
this meta narrative, and then you come to the wisdom literature, and it doesn't
You're like,
seem
what's
to
that?
advance the narrative for most people. Most people come to it, and we won't talk about Ecclesiastes. We won't talk about Song of Songs. We won't talk about those, but we will talk
Yeah.
about Job because you have spent an inordinate amount of time in Job, a ridiculous amount of time in a good way.
Yes.
Tell me, okay, so for those of you guys that don't know, Ellie, you did either a podcast or you wrote a post. You wrote a post, right, about memorizing. What was the site you wrote for?
Yeah, so I'm part of a library here in Cambridge, which is called Tyndale House.
Hmm.
And yeah, for that library, they have a regular publication they put out called Ink Magazine. And so I wrote a piece, an article about memorizing Job in Hebrew.
Yes. Yeah, I'll
Um,
link that in the video description so folks can check it out. But yeah, you heard that right, viewers. Memorized the book of Job. Now, I've memorized maybe half a chapter of a book, so, and that's in English.
yep.
Ellie memorized Job in Hebrew. So tell us, one,
Why?
why? Well, I mean, obviously, you have your own story why, and you cover it in the article. I don't want to double dip too much, but what was the initial impetus for being like, I'm going to memorize this thing and I'm going to do it in Hebrew?
Yeah. Essentially, JM, because I was so flummoxed by the book, I just really came to it
Mm.
aware that I was most dominantly intimidated and perplexed. I didn't do a PhD in Job because I thought, oh, I have this well developed set of conceptions of how this book works and why it matters.
Mm.
Uh, I did submit a proposal in Job, but once I found myself actually, yeah, looking down the face of 3 years, wrestling with this text, yeah, I just felt a bit at a loss of what to do. And so I suppose the way that I then tried to remedy my posture was to say, okay, let me just assume my ignorance rather than assuming that there's something deficient in the text, or rather than, assuming that this will be predominantly a glum and unsatisfying prospect. Like, no, no, no. Let me just say, if I know that God has given this in the scriptures, then it is for my good. And I just don't know it yet. Like, I'm just not clued into that yet. And so, why don't I just put the text inside of me, pray, and see what happens? And so, yeah, it's really this effort to essentially do what I call an embodied doctrine of scripture experiment. Like, if my convictions about the text are such, then yeah, I can just be on a journey as a student, not thinking the pressure, the stress would come in from thinking, I need to master this. I need to like
Right.
get on top of it. But if I'm actually just trying to be mastered by the God who gave the text, then I just get to trip around as a wide-eyed student with curiosity.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I thought that would be useful to do. And it also just felt really counterintuitive to memorize Job of all things. Like most parts of the Psalter are much more readily registerable as edifying.
Yeah.
And Job is just, yeah, for most of it, you're wondering why people are still talking and if they're even saying good things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what
Yeah.
is your so what's the you have not memorized any other books of scripture before that?
I think I memorized Colossians in English several
Okay.
years before, but certainly nothing on the scale of Job and
Right.
nothing. Well, I'd maybe done a psalm or two in Hebrew, but yeah, nothing near what this project was. I just knew that the human brain probably could. So I was like, all right, we'll just see how this works.
Yeah, yeah, it probably could.
Yeah.
And for a lot of ancient Israelites, it probably did. Like many of them
Yeah.
had these books, the whole scripture memorized by heart. And of course, they didn't have, music videos and movie quotes and things jumping around in their head, crowding out the space.
Yeah.
But, if you're going to memorizing a book, jumping into one of the hardest books in terms of at least the Hebrew and the words, literally, there are
Yeah.
words in Job that aren't anywhere else in the Bible. And
Yeah.
so why not know them in Hebrew rather than
Yeah.
various English guesses?
Exactly. So that was part of the impetus, the main impetus for doing it in Hebrew as opposed to English. I just knew this is a particularly difficult text in Hebrew. So rather than memorizing an English translation and always wondering and needing to go back and check to see what Hebrew they're trying to render, how they've made sense of it,
Right.
why don't I just put the Hebrew in me? And it actually, I found as I went, I don't actually know that this is the case, but sometimes I was like, I feel like they want me to memorize this, like whoever's putting this book together, because it just tipped me off to so much artistry and brilliance in the composition of the book that I wouldn't have otherwise seen if I was only dealing in the English text.
Right.
Obviously, there's so much to glean, and we're really grateful for Bible translations into people's heart languages, obviously.
Sure.
Yeah, but for my purposes in doing a dissertation, it's been really useful to see connections across the text and even between lines of poetry that I may have otherwise missed. So
Yeah,
yeah,
there's no I mean, we're not language snobs here in the dojo by any means. Michael Halcomb and I have talked about this, that you don't have to have the languages for salvation, for holiness, for any of that. But when you do have access to the language, it deepens the well. There's more that you see. It just makes it easier in a lot of, even though it's harder to acquire the language. Once you have a proficiency, even a basic proficiency in it, it makes it easier to study the text. And things like you said, things jump out. We're doing that in our Psalm study here in the dojo, like just poking through the Hebrew text and pointing out, hey, this word's used here. And in English translations, it gets glossed over because it doesn't work in English, but this is an important concept. And so I imagine Job is filled with things like that because of its artistic nature.
yeah. And I will say as well, I just think increasingly as I study the Bible on a dispositional level, there's got to be something so good about the Bible being hard. Like I think want to encourage people generally that as readers of the Bible, let's not expect that it ought to be easy or that it's better if it's easy. I think actually if we frame ourselves with the expectation that actually the scriptures are difficult in a lot of respects,
Yeah.
but they're more glorious than we can imagine as well. And so, what if we get to think, oh, I get to, for a lifetime in the community of God's people, just
Mm.
be wrestling with this text? I think that'll actually cultivate more holiness in me if I'm engaged in something hard and worthwhile for a
Yeah.
long time
Oh,
with others.
that's a great word of guidance. I might just cut that and post it as its own short on YouTube because that I chalk that up to our modern mostly Western evangelicalism wanting four spiritual laws, steps to peace with God, the Romans road, like just give us the simple bump, bump, bump so that we can get on to more important things. And the
Yeah.
gospel becomes this thing that you just you simplify it as much as possible, get people to accept it, make them come forward and make a profession at the crescendo of the music at the altar call,
Yeah.
and and it's just not, that's so antithetical to discipleship, the life
Yeah.
of wrestling and striving and trying to be like the master.
Yeah.
That's a
And I
great, I love that. The Bible should be hard in some ways.
Yeah.
And that's
And
a
I think
beauty.
that also then really helps us when we come to something like the wisdom literature,
Hmm.
which is, yeah, often feels quite puzzling.
Yeah.
I mean, even just take the genre of the proverb, like they are little riddles. You're
Hmm.
meant to turn them over and sit with them and try them out and yeah, really puzzle through their meaning.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, there's something that's happening in terms of pedagogy. Like you're learning a certain way of paying attention and a certain kind of discernment.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think just being in the Old Testament more generally has helped me build out this richer portrait of the human vocation. Like, what is God actually after in a new created person in Jesus?
Hmm.
And actually, it's a much richer portrait of being these renewed image bearers who keep company with God and who become wise as they listen to God's voice. It's not just sort of this quick escape from the fire. Like,
Right.
yes, we do need salvation, um, in a sort of, yeah, like being saved from judgment and wrath. Absolutely. God wants to remake us though into these whole new persons who are crowned with glory and honor and
Hmm.
are wise rulers over the creation that he's entrusted to us.
Yeah.
And for that, yeah, we need time and wrestling.
Yeah, we're
Um,
being saved for rather than just being saved from.
yeah,
There's a vocational aspect and a wrestling and a growth and discipleship. It's
yeah,
lifelong. That's
yeah.
the pattern of this ministry is patterned after martial arts and striving and sparring and rolling and doing all the stuff that make you a better
Mm,
martial artist and that's what we need in biblical studies too. And I love that you're doing it. I love that you're inspiring people to do it. But enough dancing around. We got Job. It's a weird book. There's a
yeah.
lot of questions that viewers asked. I submitted this. We're going to take some of those questions after. First, I would love for you as they say on social media, explain it in crayon. Like talk Job to somebody who's an utter dummy, doesn't know anything about the book except there's something about the devil, and then a guy who has a lot of patience, maybe, because that's a saying, patience of Job, although does he? And
Um,
and then in the end, everything works out. So, oh,
yeah.
and there's also dinosaurs or monsters in it. Who knows? So that's where I'm coming from. I'm
Yeah.
going to play the student. What is Job? How should I start reading this book?
Great, great. So yeah, do interrupt me along the way if I've slipped in some jargon that's unhelpful.
I'll keep it
Um,
low shelf.
yeah, no, this is good. Yeah, so I think most people conventionally, if they know anything about the book of Job, they would have this tag that just says suffering that they stuck on the book, put it on the shelf, and they kind of think, okay, I guess that's supposed to be something of a textbook
Hmm.
for when I feel like I'm suffering a lot. Um, the hard thing there is that it's just in the scriptures, and I think the scriptures are generally meant to be accessed at any time and are meant to be instructive and formative in every respect. So that's maybe our first problem. Second problem is that I think for most people, if they have that mentality, as soon as they pull the book of Job down. They may be thinking either I'm not suffering enough, like I've not had everything stripped away from me like Job has, so maybe I can't actually relate to him. Or maybe they're thinking, this is actually just way too hard. Like I had one person say to me that when she's going through a really difficult period of personal trial, someone said to her, "Oh, just go read Job." And she's like, "I have nowhere close to the bandwidth right now to make it through that book."
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's just a general encouragement to say, let's maybe step back. And yes, there is suffering involved in the book of Job. Absolutely. I think there's a lot more going on. So yeah, we'll start walking our way through. In terms of the literary structure, there is on either side of a large poetic block a prose narrative frame. So you have two chapters of prose, usually it's called the prologue of Job. And then you hit, well, yeah, from chapter 3 to 42:6, you have lots of poetry. And then you have just 11 verses of prose to round out the book, typically called the epilogue. So that's, yeah, the most basic way of talking about the book's literary structure, just on a kind of a form standpoint. Now, in these, what's going on in the prologue? All right, so in the first 3 verses, you meet someone who looks like everything is going as perfectly as it could. So you meet Job. He is this person of consummate integrity, like the poster boy for piety. And in fact, he's described in these 4 terms, his righteous character, that makes him more glowingly righteous than any other figure in the Old Testament. Like you're just supposed to see superlative. This is a man of integrity. And he's flourishing. So he's wealthy. He has a large, happy household. And it just seems that all is well in the world. And then you have the conflict introduced when you shift scenes. So there's a lot of scene shifting going on in the first 2 chapters between earth and heaven. So you start on earth, you meet Job, and then whoop, now we've shifted scenes and we're listening in, as it were, on this heavenly conversation. It's like we're eavesdropping as readers. And you see God in front of something of a heavenly assembly. And among this heavenly assembly comes what English Bibles typically call Satan. Now, I guess first thing to say here is that I am, as a caveat, so grateful for English Bible translators. Job's a really hard book to translate. So yes and amen. They're doing good work. They're doing the best they can. If I were to translate Job, I would not put Satan there. So the Hebrew word is ha-satan. So you can hear Satan in there, which is the Hebrew word from which we get our English word Satan. We've just transliterated that. However, that ha on the front is what's called a definite article. It's basically the. So we're saying the Satan. And Satan as a noun in Hebrew means to be an opposer, an adversary. And so I would just translate it as something like the adversary. So it's kind of this being among the heavenly ranks who has this adversarial function. And essentially, what the adversary does is he calls into question Job's piety. Is it sincere? Is it the case, potentially, that Job only looks righteous because he gets all this good stuff from God? So there's actually a transactional relationship going on. It's like divine nepotism or something, where Job is just, putting in the righteous deed, getting out the next camel or something. And so that's what we're setting up is Job's fear of God, which is a way of talking about his whole life posture of allegiance to God. Is that genuine or is it insincere? So we're asking a motive question. Why is it that he fears God? And of course, the only way to test the interior will be to strip away the exterior. So perhaps to the reader's surprise, God says, okay. The adversary says, well, let's just take away everything he has and then he'll turn on you. And God says, okay. And in 2 rounds, so there's quite a stylized feel to the prologue where you have these repetitious ways of narrating the scenes. But there are 2 rounds of disasters that fall upon Job. And in short, at the end of it, all of his children are dead, all of his wealth is gone, and his body has been afflicted with these painful boils. And so he's thrust into a state of mourning on the ground. And in a bewildering 2 chapters, the guy who had everything has lost everything.
Mm.
And essentially, I think what the book is doing in the prologue is setting up this extreme thought experiment, which is to say, what happens if you take the most righteous person imaginable and subject them to the most intense, incongruous suffering imaginable? What then is to be said for the fear of the Lord? Is it possible? Is it credible? Is it worthwhile to go on in sort of this trusting allegiance to God? Job is one who has turned away from evil. From Ra is the Hebrew word. And that word Ra could also be translated bad or disaster. And it's said in the prologue, both by Job and by the narrator, that Ra has come upon him.
Right.
And he blesses God, but when he's covered with boils from the sole of his foot to the top of his head, that's pulling a phrase straight out of Deuteronomy 28, which is one of the covenant curses. So Job looks cursed, even though he just blessed God.
Right.
And so you know, though, as the reader, that Job has done nothing to deserve this. So there's no getting around the unfairness of his predicament. It's deliberately unfair on purpose. And so you as the reader are caught in this difficult place of being able to empathize with Job. It feels viscerally unfair what has happened to him. And you wonder, how on earth could God let this happen to him, allow this, sanction this? And at the same time, though, you have this omniscience as the reader. It's setting up dramatic irony where you know more than the characters in the story know,
Right.
because you've been watching this scene switching happen and you've been listening in on the heavenly conversation, which just puts you in quite an interesting vantage point as you progress through the rest of the book, thinking you know, and yet at the same time having your own doubts and questions about the God who's governing this world. Job has these initially really faithful responses in the prologue. So 2 times after both rounds of disasters, he responds in trust. So he's intact at this point. And you're like, okay, good. And the narrator says explicitly, Job didn't sin in what he said. Then you get to the end of the prologue, and in the last 3 verses, so chapter 2, verse 11 to 13, Job has 3 friends come to join him. And so now is, where we start getting ready to shift into some new territory. We now have some characters who will be high profile for the next many, many chapters.
Many.
Yes. And I guess it's worth mentioning as well, I didn't say this yet, but Job is set basically, one way of putting it is a long time ago in a land far away.
Right.
So Job kind of looks like he's a contemporary of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. There are numerous factors in the text that, seem to set the book in that period. And Job is non-Israelite, and the friends that come to visit him are non-Israelite. They're Easterners. So these friends come to Job, and initially they just join him in his morning ritual. They sit on the ground with him in silence for 7 days. And as a reader, when you hit the end of a 7-day mourning period, you're thinking, okay, like from a ritual mourning standpoint, if the friends come as comforters, their role is to sort of facilitate Job's transition out from the state of mourning back into normal life. And you expect that to happen after 7 days.
Yeah.
But then you hit chapter 3. And now Job opens his mouth and curses. And you're like, oh no, is he going to curse God? No, he curses the day of his birth. But he launches into this poem where he wishes he could undo his own birth. Basically, I wish I'd never been alive. It'd be better than this. And kind of wants to undo the entire order of the cosmos. And at this point, as the reader, you're just like, wait, is he allowed to say that? He didn't quite curse God, but that sounds like a really audacious thing to say. But the narrator's left. You have no more narrator now for a long while. So you as the reader are trying to adjudicate what Job is saying. And then his friends start chiming in. And all the more, now you're trying to make sense of, okay, are the friends saying different things from each other? Where are they disagreeing with Job? Does their debate actually progress in substance or just in tone as they continue on for so many chapters? So you're trying to evaluate this as a reader. Essentially what happens, so from chapters 3 to 27, you have these dialogue cycles between Job and his friends. And they're quite orderly in one respect. So you get Job, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar. First cycle, repeat. And you get that for 2 cycles, but then you get to the third and it's incomplete. So you get Job, Eliphaz, Job, tiny Bildad speech, Job, Job, and there's no Zophar. So you're like, what's going on there?
Hmm.
Job is a book of structural puzzles. Like you can see all these literary sections, but figuring out how it fits together and what it's communicating together is the real challenge.
Right.
So I think it's useful to basically think of the debate going on between Job and his friends as like a triangle. It's like there are 3 points on this triangle, and you can only choose 2. So one is that Job is innocent.
Hmm.
Another is that God is just. And a third is that the retribution principle is operative in the world. The retribution principle being that actions and consequences have this reliable correspondence. So if you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad.
Right.
And the friends are insistent that God is just and insistent that the retribution principle is at play.
Hmm.
And so what they end up doing, at first a bit more gently and subtly, but they become increasingly pointed in their accusations towards Job. The temperature really turns up on this debate as you progress. But that essentially means that they have to come to the conclusion that Job is not innocent because they reverse the retribution principle. And they're like, well, if you've had bad stuff happen to you, therefore you must have done some bad stuff.
Right.
So Job, here's what you need to do. Just repent, return to God, you'll be restored. So they have a very neat explanation and a very tidy prescription for how to get out. Job, for his part, is very convinced that he is innocent. And actually, you as the reader know that too, because you've read the prologue. That puts Job in this really difficult place then of negotiating the retribution principle and God's justice, which are related, because you'd think if God is just, ought he not to uphold the retribution principle? It looks fair, right?
Right.
But Job basically vacillates between saying God is just a capricious tyrant, then maybe, or maybe retribution is just broken in the world, and that's not actually the way the world works, which would then also mean that God isn't very just in some way. So Job's really wrestling here. He feels like God's attacking him. He feels like God's become his enemy. And yeah, I will say though, for all of his brash speech, is certainly not an angry atheist. Like he is emphatically Godward in his disposition. He knows that God is responsible for what happens in God's world, and that's the one he has to argue it out with. And increasingly, as you go along, you just see him entertaining these hypotheticals about how could I meet with God himself? And what would it look like? What would the liabilities be if I were to actually confront God himself? But he does press towards this direct encounter, sometimes speaking to God directly in second person. Okay, so you watch this unfolding as the reader. And I think what happens in the third dialogue cycle is that basically you watch it devolve. So you've seen, I think of the friends as like the tenured professors having their best go at trying to answer. So the Hebrew, is just exceptionally witty, eloquent, erudite. I mean, they're engaged in this battle of wits. And they're these Easterners, so they're from a tradition renowned for wisdom, and they're these old wise men. And so the point being, if anyone ought to be able to answer Job as a human, it should be these 3. But you watch them exhaust everything they could have to say until they quite literally run out of words. I think that's why the third dialogue cycle is incomplete, to showcase that. And Job's not satisfied. He's certainly not comforted.
Right.
He calls them miserable comforters. And at the end of chapter 27, the friends have dropped off. Then you hit chapter 28, which is another one of these puzzles, because all of a sudden you've stepped into this contemplative exposition on the nature of the pursuit of wisdom. And the pursuit of wisdom or search for wisdom is compared to mining. So humans have this unique ingenuity among creatures to be able to access what is hidden, what is in darkness, and to bring it to light. And those things are precious. These materials, these stones and minerals that they're able to bring up from the ground are of great value. And they have unparalleled capacity to do that. Not even the most keen-eyed birds or powerful beasts can access these treasures. Yet, when it comes to the search for wisdom, which the poem is quite clear is immeasurably more valuable, humans, along with everything else in creation, are entirely at a loss. So you can search long, wide, high, deep, and you can't bring what is in darkness to light when it comes to wisdom. And this, I think, is basically a narratorial interlude providing commentary on what we've just watched. What have we just watched but humans searching for an answer?
Right.
Searching for wisdom, as it were, for the explanation. And yet, what have they come up with? They've not been able to furnish an answer. At the end of the poem, though, you get this transition. Thankfully, there is one who knows wisdom, because there's only one who comprehends to comprehensive degree everything that goes on under the heavens. And in fact, it's God himself, the one who wielded wisdom in his very act of creating. And then the very last verse, you get this really, oh man, biblical scholars don't like this. They don't know what to do with it because it feels wildly out of place. Wisdom has been hidden, and now all of a sudden it's candidly explicated. It's defined. God says to man, to Adam actually, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, to turn from evil is understanding. And so my phrase for this is humans, stay in your wisdom lane. Like you can't actually comprehend everything that goes on under all the heavens, but God does. And he's actually given you a real participation in his wisdom. And you know what it looks like? It looks like what Job looked like from the beginning, fearing God and turning away from evil. That was part of his description from the very first verse of the book. So that's kind of, you have to sort of park that. The book hasn't finished yet, but I do think you have this commentary on what's gone before.
Right.
Now, chapters 20.
Very much in line with Ecclesiastes, by the way. That idea of going around, looking, and then boom, it's here. And it seems anticlimactic. It's like that's where the book of Proverbs begins. So we've done this whole journey just to get back to the fear of the Lord. There's got to be more. There's got to be some esoteric answer, some kind of hidden knowledge.
I wonder if so much of the pushback to that conclusion in scholarship is simply because we have this bias for the esoteric as being sophisticated and somehow better.
Right.
Yeah. So the word simplistic is used all the time for the prologue of Job, for this ending of the poem. It's just too simple.
Right.
But actually, I think perhaps the most profound thing you could say, and it will only, I think that impression will only grow as we get towards the end of the book.
Yeah.
So you move then into the next 3 chapters, which I see as a block, 29 to 31, which are sort of Job's last stand here. So you get 29, he's reminiscing about the good old days. Oh, my life used to be so different. I used to have this fellowship with God and this flourishing in society and this, place of honor among my contemporaries. And then chapter 30 is, now I've been plunged into utter abjection and everything's horrible.
Right.
And then chapter 31 is essentially Job calling God to court in a very direct way. So it's often called an oath of innocence. He lists out, here is all of the evidence of my integrity. And he ends toward the very bottom of the chapter with, let the Almighty answer me. All right, God, come defend yourself, explain yourself. Prove either these oaths wrong. Please show me that I haven't done these, or presumably you need to withdraw what you've been doing because I don't deserve this. So you're at this place already. We've been building tension for a long time for God to answer. Job's been talking about it, wondering about it. And now you hit this point where you're like, okay, he's just summoned him. Let the Almighty answer me. Maybe it's time.
Right.
The words of Job are ended at the end of the chapter. And then you have an entirely different interlocutor that you didn't even know existed appear on the scene.
Yeah.
And this is Elihu. And Elihu is, oh man, another really puzzling chap. He's particularly challenging because he's not mentioned anywhere else in the book.
Right.
So when you get to the end, God will evaluate Job and his friends, these 3 that were just dialoguing with him. But Elihu's not mentioned anywhere else. You don't get God or the narrator telling you what to make of him. So it leads to really polarizing positions. Either people say Elihu's basically saying the same thing as God is saying, which is why he doesn't need to be addressed. Some people even go so far as to say, like, maybe he's a Christophany. That'd be like the most extreme on that side.
Yep.
Or you say Elihu is just such rubbish that God blows past him and is like, let me get on with my answer. And I would be of the persuasion that Elihu definitely has a legitimate literary function in the book. However, he has negative characterization. So I would be, more on the side of saying we are very ready for God's answer at this point, and we're very keenly aware of the fact that humans are incapable of providing definitive resolution for Job.
Yeah.
And what do we have now but another human making perhaps even more inflated claims about being perfect in knowledge and assuring Job that he will provide this answer. He's this neutral third-party arbiter who's been listening in to this whole debate and presumes to be able to provide an answer, which, importantly, he assumes God will not provide. So I think, in a way, my working hypothesis is that Elihu is like the author writing the reader into the book. So here you are as this reader who's had opinion, right? You've read the prologue, and so you think you know, but the narrator had dropped out. So you've now been sitting here trying to evaluate. And as you've progressed, you're probably thinking, oh, I can see how the friends are misapplying things to Job's situation. But if I could do this in a more nuanced way, I could have something to offer Job.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Elihu has the only Israelite name in the book.
Well, I was just going to ask you, Elihu is definitely, he is my God.
He is my God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is there any significance, his lineage, like the Buzite family of Ram?
Okay. Here's a hot take. I have a theory that, so you can look up those parts of his name and see, for instance, that Ram is in the genealogy coming from Boaz at the end of Ruth. Buzite, Uz and Buz are meant to be, they show up in a genealogy in Genesis.
Yeah.
So you have kind of this interesting, mixture genealogically. I think he both, if you take those as indicating sort of family descent, it both helps to situate him within a more Israelite milieu and also keeps him Eastern in a way. It's kind of a mix of both, along with having this Israelite name.
Yeah.
I am inclined, though, to actually think about what those mean as Hebrew words. So Elihu ben Berachel, so son of Berachel. So that's the Hebrew word for bless and the Hebrew word for God put next to each other. And actually, the last time we heard bless God in the book was Job's wife in chapter 2, who said to Job, well, okay, this is going to get us slightly. She said to him, curse God and die. That's what English translations say. Interestingly, in chapters 1 and 2 of Job, every time your English Bible says curse, they're translating the Hebrew word bless.
Right. It does double duty.
Hebrew word bless is doing a lot of work in the Job and prologue, and that's probably a bit of a tangent.
Yeah.
But
we have that. English has that as at least Southern English. When somebody says, "Oh, they blessed him out," it means they cursed him out. Yeah.
Whoa, we have like a Hebraism in our.
The more neutral, the more friendly is bless your heart, which is not a good thing. It means, oh, you're so ridiculous, you're so stupid, you're so pitiful. But to bless something, that's an older Southern idiom.
Interesting.
For curse.
So Job's wife's basically saying, do that to God.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, okay, last time we heard bless God was Job's wife. That doesn't bode well. And then habuzi, the root buz in Hebrew, it means despise. So if you have Elihu, son of bless God, the despiser, from the family Ram, which means exalted. Right. I'm just like, ooh, I don't know if that's boding well for the posture he'll have towards Job and, the sort of narrative or literary relationship he'll have.
So with something like would you say Elihu is like the haughty sort of Israelite, or like the haughty, the uplift, because he is very, he knows. Yeah. He knows his worth in his eyes.
Yeah. He's also young.
Right.
So I think the other thing going on is that the friends were the old perspective. So just in case you thought that they were maybe a bit too monolithic and there was something else that could be said outside of their perspective, well, now you pull in the young guy.
Right.
And so it's like you're just wringing dry the sponge of everything that humans could possibly say. You had the old, now you have the young. So I think that's maybe another bit going on. And he's conspicuously angry. So it says 4 times, just a couple verses in his little prose introduction, that he's angry.
Yeah.
And for me, that's also worth paying attention to, because when God will answer Job, he never once says that he burns with anger at him.
Right.
He will at the friends, I think for a slightly different reason than Elihu does. But Elihu's conspicuously angry and conspicuously young from the outset. So anyway, you have to persevere through 6 chapters of Elihu. And it's a monologue at this point. So it's broken up into 4 different speeches, but he actually never engages in any exchange with Job. So you could say communication is so broken at this point that, yeah, you don't even have dialogue. You just have monologue, actually. And all the more now, you're just like, oh, my goodness. I think for people who find the poetic core of Job really hard to get through because it's confusing, it feels frustrating, it feels tiresome, I'm like, perfect. I think the book's trying to do that to you.
Right.
I think you're meant to feel that way by the time you get to this point. So do read the whole book. I know it's hard to get through. But yeah, as you progress through Elihu, he actually ends with this statement that the Almighty cannot be found in his second to last verse. And then what do you have? Chapter 38. Then God answered and said from the whirlwind. And oh man, so much to say about the divine whirlwind speeches. Feel free to ask me particular questions if you want to draw.
Well, what I would, before we move to God showing up, is there a way for people to wrap their minds around the theme or the thrust of each friend? Or do they all use interchangeable arguments and there's no real distinction? Like, so the names Zophar, Bildad,
Eliphaz,
thank you. How can those are just nonsense names to most people. They don't mean anything. So is there anything that identify, like if you were going to picture them or cartoon illustrate them or describe each one temperamentally or something, like Elihu, young buck, full of himself, angry, ready to talk and shut these old geezers up and drop some knowledge bombs. That's what he's the hero of his story, it seems. And he's going to defend God's honor because that's his job. And so how would the other 3, how would you caricature the other 3?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've seen a couple of scholars who do really try to delineate their perspectives and sometimes even their temperaments and say, here's kind of the unique Eliphaz spin, here's the Bildad spin, and here's the Zophar spin.
Yeah.
I personally, and most other people that I'm reading, really treat them as a character unit. And I'm inclined to do that for a couple of reasons. For one, when they're referred to, they always come together. So they're introduced as a unit in chapter 2. God will evaluate them as a unit in chapter 42. Elihu is angry with them as a unit and addresses them as a unit. So yeah, it just seems to me that it's more natural to kind of group them together based on how the book is talking about them. And I think as well, like, why have 3 then? Why not just have 1? I think there could be something to be said in really focusing this debate on Job. So if there was just Job and 1 interlocutor the whole time, it might feel like this more sort of even balance of perspectives and experiences. But actually this way, it really is all focusing around Job.
Right.
And yeah, and I think as they sort of progress through the different cycles, and as you see the next character coming around, it does, I think, add to the challenge as well of evaluation, because one of the questions you're asking is, are they saying anything different? And I would ultimately say, I think not. And you sort of watch them collectively run out of steam.
And there's no like literary difference between the way they talk or, it's all just kind of reads the same.
Yeah, I feel like to me, it would require a bit too much fine parsing. Like the retribution principle is just writ large across them all.
Right.
Like I said, they kind of develop in terms of how explicit they become, how um, sort of offensive they become towards Job.
Mhm.
Uh, but they're all operating on the very similar premise. Um, and in fact, like in the case of Zophar, we just have so much less from him as well because we don't even have a third speech.
Mhm.
I think there may, if I were to say anything to distinguish them, there may be a sense in which Eliphaz is kind of ringleader.
Mm.
So he has the longest speeches. He becomes sort of the most pointedly accusatory towards Job, in that in chapter 22, he's going through specific breaches of basically covenant law, though we're not operating within an Israelite milieu. But he's telling Job things like, you've stripped away the clothing from those who needed it, and you've withheld food from the hungry. And he's just, fabricating these charges. And then when God addresses them in the epilogue, he speaks to Eliphaz and says, I'm angry with you and your two friends. So even there, they're still treated as a unit, but there is a way in which I guess Eliphaz may be something of a figurehead
Yeah.
for the three.
That's helpful. That's helpful to know. But it makes
Yeah.
sense why a lot of people struggle with delineating the three. If they
Yeah.
if they're kind of like repeating the same perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the very relevant questions for me as I was memorizing the book is why on earth is it so long?
Right.
Right? Because everything takes the same amount of time to memorize. So you're like, why do you guys keep going? Like, I thought we had it covered, by the first round. But as I said, I think there's much more to be said for the Job journey that you're going on, actually, in preparation to hear God's voice.
Mhm.
And it's appropriate that you should feel this strain of waiting, this building uncertainty and yet desperation. We absolutely need God's voice to break into this impasse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then he does in 38. He shows
Yeah.
up, and there's different ways that people have read God's words to Job. My friend Richard Middleton has his take in Abraham's silence was very much pushing against the grain of a lot of interpretations and saying that God actually wasn't mad with Job, and he kind of reads a little more playfulness or kind of like a wink in the eye at some point. And others have said, no, he's clearly putting Job, basically tells Job, pull up your pants, boy. I'm about to take you to the woodshed and show you, like there's just these two very different ways of reading it. So what is happening in your mind after 30 something, 40, nearly 40 chapters of monotony when God does show up?
Yeah. I'm actually inclined to kind of cut through the middle of those and say that God is certainly emphatically setting the terms of this encounter. So if Job made any mistake, it was sort of getting out of alignment in the creator-creature distinction. So he knows that God is not like him, but when he tries to summon God to court and acts like God is attacking him like this adversary, he's proceeding as if he and God were these opposing parties that could sort of meet each other in combat. And God just throws that entirely into question. And he's like, I am responsive, Job. I'm not coercible. And so I will set the terms of this encounter. I will ask the questions and you will answer me. Thank you very much. And so it very much is insisting in theological terms on God's transcendence, that God is not like you. There is this creator-creature distinction. And yet, God is not against you. And maybe it's good news that God is not like you, Job. And from the very fact that God answered and said, it uses the same speech introduction formula as every other person responding to Job in the book. So it's like God steps into the conversation,
Right.
which is remarkable. Like before we even start looking at the content, we need to pause on the fact that God answers. And that when he answers, Job isn't crushed. He's not swept away like the wicked in a whirlwind. Like he said would happen in chapter 27 of the wicked. And even said in chapter 9, oh, I love this. He said, if I called and he answered me, I don't believe that he'd be listening to my voice. For he'd crush me with a whirlwind and multiply my wounds for no reason. And reading that, you're like, oh, I know that this has happened to Job for no reason. It's the Hebrew word chinam.
Mm.
But yet when you see this whirlwind, the se'ara, come up in chapter 38, you're like, oh no. But there Job is meeting God in dialogue. And Job must register right away that God's been listening already, because the divine whirlwind speeches use this language and imagery from earlier in the book, and it's woven throughout his response in a way that, yeah, you just get the sense that he's been listening, that he's not answering Job on Job's terms, but this is an answer. This is a
Right.
credible interaction. And basically, I would headline the first speech as "What do you know?" and the second speech is "What can you do?" So there are really these knowledge and power emphases. It's not as if power is absent from the first speech. The second speech really doesn't use language related to knowledge, so that is much more of a, yeah, what is your capacity to govern? What's
Right.
your power? And essentially, I think what God is doing is he's gesturing for Job to all of the wild and untamable reaches of creation that lie at the periphery of what humans can know and understand and what they can control. And basically to say, Job, if you can't demonstrate your comprehension, your competence, or your capacity in any of these areas, then how much less do you think that you could actually operate in an oppositional relationship with me, the one who created all of this, and come out all right? Like, of course, that's just absurd.
Right.
And so I think what it does basically is it presses Job into this crisis of decision, which is, are you willing to trust God to understand what you cannot know and to rule what you cannot control? Like, these limits, these creaturely limitations of knowledge and power aren't going anywhere. Job, are you willing to stay in your wisdom lane, as it were, and trust God to be God? And so I really see it as this wedding of God's transcendence and God's immanence in this answer. And I see that Job is satisfied. So one of the challenging, there are many challenging texts to translate, but one that generates a lot of discussion and dispute in scholarship is how Job responds to God the second time around. So in chapter 42, verses 1-6, you get Job's final response to God. And firstly, he declares, okay, you want me to say what I know now? I know, God, that you can do all things and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. And basically then he acknowledges, I've spoken outside of my bounds, outside of my wisdom lane. And so there's this sort of acquiescence there. And what satisfies him, he says, in verse 5, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye has seen you. It is this direct encounter with God for which he's been longing all the while. That's what satiated him. And what I do with that last verse, so as far as I'm aware, most English translations translate verse 6 in terms of repentance.
Right. Something
like, I despise myself and repent on dust and ashes, or something like that. It's a tricky verse. Therefore, I reject, refuse, despise, not quite sure what to do with that first verb. And it doesn't actually have a direct object. So it doesn't say myself. The translator's supplying that in an effort to make sense of the text, which is fair. But there is actually no direct object in the Hebrew. And then the second verb, which is being translated as I repent, is actually the same verbal root for comfort, which has been a really high profile word throughout the entire book. Job's friends came as comforters, and it's recurred throughout the poetry as Job has told them that they're being useless on the comfort front. And so as I see it, I would actually say something like, therefore I reject and am comforted concerning dust and ashes. That is to say, dust and ashes kind of standing for his present state of mourning.
Right.
Into which he's been plunged. What has comforted Job? What has he really needed to be satiated and to be ready to move from this death-like state of mourning back into the land of the living, as it were, and rejoin society? It's that he's encountered God. This has been the substance of his comfort. So I think you can see Job as being both humbled and acquiescent to God, granting that he has spoken, as God says, words without knowledge, darkening God's counsel. And yet at the same time, it doesn't have to mean that Job is sort of ground into the dust by God and is just, yeah, you take a suffering man and you just heap abuse on him, which is at its worst how people are taking the divine whirlwind speeches to be sort of this divine bullying.
Yeah.
But I don't think you need to go there at all. I just think that theological tensions are real, especially when you have a creator and creature who are ontologically different, engaged in a genuine relationship.
Yeah.
Like you should expect there to be paradox there and tension.
There's not any equity, and it's unfortunate that the translations in English do say. I had to look at the Hebrew, but yeah, emas. I repent, or they say I despise myself, and that's. That's not. I think that's not a good translation. I was just looking at Hallett, who glosses it as revoke, or to reject what has previously been said. Which, in English, despise myself is like this self-loathing, and it makes Job like this groveling before God, and I despise myself. I mean, it plays very much into a super. Total depravity reform view, like an unhealthy extreme of that, where even at our holiest, we're just despised, awful sinners, blah, blah, blah. But that's really not what the Hebrew is pushing for.
And I also want to say, like, there's got to be a way to hold on to the dignity of divine rebuke. Mm-hmm. Like, the most tragic thing in the book, beyond the loss of his camels, even the loss of his children, would be if God never answered.
Right.
Like, the fact that God actually steps into the conversation and rebukes Job for speaking out about, like, how encouraging is that?
Right.
Consistent witness of the scriptures is that there is this freedom within a God-fearing relationship to speak to God honestly. And this actually, we need to get into the epilogue real quick because this has implications.
Let's do it. The epilogue. First of all, is it tacked on? Is it original? Is it somebody was like, we can't end the story this way. It's got to have a happy ending. What's happening?
Yeah. So I'm a fan generally of saying the text is the text that we have. And so if I don't understand what it's doing, maybe I should just probably do a bit more work and try to understand, the communicative intent of the whole. And it's important to me to read it in sequence as well. Lots of people kind of excise the prologue and epilogue and read that together and then kind of set it in opposition to the poetic core.
Yeah.
But I think actually, let's just read from beginning to end. And when you have a frame tale, like that is a thing to do in literature, and you expect it to come back around at the end. You expect the frame to be complete.
Right.
So what you have happening now, though, is that God has addressed Job from the whirlwind, and now he turns and he speaks in a second direction. And he is addressing the friends. And I mentioned before that he burns with anger towards them. So that's, first thing to notice. He didn't burn with anger towards Job, but there's something kind of escalated going on now when he turns to the friends. He's angry with them. And, JM, this is another place where I think our translation is so critical for what we do with the reason that God is angry.
Right.
Because it's so important. We've been wondering all throughout the dialogues, how do we evaluate this stuff? Is Job right? Are the friends right? The friends say a lot of things that sound pretty good. Yeah. And so you're wondering what to make of it. But why is God angry? Okay, so this will really help us as we look back on the book. Okay, every English translation barring one, someone recently pointed out to me that the LEB is closer to how I would render it. But they say something to the effect of, you've not spoken of or about me what is true or correctly, something like that, as my sermon Job has. And what that does for us as the reader is it sends us back into the book thinking that we need to evaluate the speech in terms of content, as if it were sort of this doctrinal thing to weigh up. But it's quite perplexing because God just rebuked Job out of the whirlwind for words without knowledge. So wait, how did Job say what was true about God if God just told him that he obscured his counsel, darkened his counsel? So that's one curiosity. Another is, as I say, that not only do the friends say lots of things that sound pretty good on your initial read, but actually when you get to the divine whirlwind speeches, you're like, oh, God even says some things that kind of resonate with what the friends were saying.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another tricky bit to make sense of. I think for so many reasons, which I will not enumerate because I have dissertation footnotes for that. I can explain, yeah, a bit if you want, but I would render that actually for you have not spoken to
To me.
me
Yeah.
readily or reliably as my servant Job has. And actually, that verb and preposition combination, so it's deber for speak, and then
Mm-hmm.
el, the preposition el in Hebrew. And when those occur together in Job, every single time it means speak to. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, earlier in that same verse, it says, after God spoke these things to Job. Like same verb and preposition combo, which
Mm-hmm.
everyone does as spoke to. And then they get to the second half of the verse and they switch it to spoke of or about. And I think it's really critical because that changes God's evaluation from being one that centers on content to direction of address.
Yeah.
And you back and realize, whoa, actually, Job has engaged in this second person address of God. He has been intent on this direct encounter with God, whereas the friends have only spoken to Job about God, not to God about Job. It's not just about a preposition. You can actually go back in the book and realize, oh, what has Job been longing for? He's been longing for someone to be on his side.
Yeah.
And actually, the friends, in their effort to defend God, have sounded more like the adversary than anything,
Right.
as they've gotten to the point of undermining Job's integrity. Like they've become those who would be closest to urging Job to curse God, like to, yeah, renounce his integrity would be an act of untruth on his part. So essentially, I see it as God being like, your focus has been entirely misplaced. You've culpably chosen the wrong side. Like, I don't need you to defend me um, at the cost of setting yourself in opposition to your friend. Like, actually be an intercessor, stand in the middle, place a hand on both, which is what Job says in chapter 9. Um,
I
and we may
want
not
to
have.
pull, hold on a second. I'm going to see. I'm going to pull up just so folks can see, because I think this is an important point and it flows well with what we do at Disciple Dojo, which is kind of nerding out. But what Ellie is saying, it's right here on your screen, Job 42:7 at the very end. And it says, Kilo, for not you have Devratim spoken. And then this is what she's saying, Eli, to me. And there's the word El. If you're looking on the screen, it's right here. I'm hovering my cursor over it. And that is a huge translation decision, because it's like you were saying, it's basically, are they saying about God, or are they saying to God? And if it's what you're suggesting, and I think looking at the Hebrew, I think it's really plain. But English translations, this is, if people don't know Hebrew, then they're kind of stuck with what they've been given. But Job, imagine Job's friends coming together, praying for Job, like speaking to God on Job's behalf, interceding for Job. They don't do that. They sit, which is good. Weep with those who weep. That's good. And then they start theologizing and trying to make sense. And that's a monumental verse. I don't want viewers to gloss over that, because it
Yeah.
really has implications for pastoral approaches to suffering and evil, and for how we read the book and how we make sense of it. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to stop and just show people, because a lot of times if you start talking about the Hebrew, people, they're just like, yeah, whatever. But it's
Yeah.
real clear looking at it on screen, like Li to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Now there are, so I looked across the Old Testament. So in about 450 uses of this combination, this verb and preposition, it either must or should, could mean spoke to. In arguably five or six, probably six, five of which are all within Jeremiah,
Hmm.
it needs to mean sort of content spoke about or concerning. But to me, that really puts the burden of proof on someone who would change the translation to of or about. I think
Right.
the way more natural way of reading it is spoke to, and I think it works in the book as a whole. Like you
Mhm.
do need to read anything contextually, right? Any translation issue is, yes, a grammatical and lexical one and a syntactical one. It's also a literary question in the context of the whole work.
Yeah.
But I think it actually makes way more sense in the sweep of the book as a whole.
Yeah.
Even if you may not have been, I think it's one of the great surprises, along with the way God answers Job from the whirlwind. You don't think initially that this is really the kind of answer that Job should have because he wanted to know why and God gave him who. You're
Yeah.
like, not the sort of answer I thought he should get. And similarly, when you're reading through the dialogues with between Job and his friends, you're probably not thinking, "Oh, you guys, you should just be interceding for him." Like, yeah, probably readers are not coming up with that,
Right.
but how arresting that God would say to them at the end, basically, "Yeah, your focus has been misplaced.
Hmm.
Uh, you're focused on providing this explanation to the inexplicable and guaranteeing a way out."
Yeah.
When actually Job needed me. Job needed God.
Yeah.
And needed you to be those who actually incarnate God's care by being those who are with Job and for Job.
Hmm.
Like that's actually what people need
Yeah.
in their suffering. They need to know God with them and for them. And the way that you convey that as a fellow human who's more like your fellow human than you are like God. So the creator creature distinction matters interpersonally as well, not just for how we relate to God. And yeah, what is the way that you actually reflect God's comfort to another? You get with them and you're for them. So
Yeah.
it's an alignment issue, I think,
Yeah.
because they'd become those who oppose Job. They'd become his opponents.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's cool how it fits with the rest of not just the wisdom literature, but the Psalms, in inviting people to lament and take their pain to God instead
yeah,
of talking about God or talking with other people about God, or like there's a hesitation people have in good Christian upbringing to be angry at God or vent to God, that you do not see that hesitation in Scripture.
yeah.
It's
And what is God
unfiltered.
commending in Job? He's like, you spoke to me. You spoke to me all along. And that doesn't mean that everything that Job said from the depths of his agony was the sanctioned representation of who God was. Like, no,
Right.
clearly Job said things that were out of bounds that God corrected. But yeah, as I was saying before, there's this freedom, this invitation. Speak to God.
Yeah.
Speak to God. Move toward him. And he will answer. Like if the scriptures teach anything, if I'm going
Yeah.
to die on any hill, it's that God answers.
Mm.
God answers supremely in Jesus, who is actually God. I've taken to saying God ultimately doesn't answer from the whirlwind, but from a womb. Like God
Mm.
actually will go to such extents to answer that he steps into the story
Yeah.
incarnate
Yeah.
um, in Jesus. So like I just see the theological inertia of the book as
Mm.
just, yeah, moving us towards Jesus as God's decisive answer,
Yeah.
as the ultimate righteous sufferer and the perfect interceding friend, you know? So Jesus is this, yeah, resounding, meeting of all of these Jobin threads that have been pulled through the book. And then fittingly, what does Job do? He intercedes for his friends right off the
Mhm.
back of this. So God says, okay, Job, now you go be an intercessor for these conspicuously uninterceding friends. And in this way, yeah, we're sort of binding up these frayed divine human and human relationships. And so it's actually quite a relational resolution, I think, in the book.
Mhm.
Not a cognitive one, not an intellectual one, but a relational one. Um, and I think, yeah, as I talk to people about their various experiences of grappling with unanswered questions that linger and with inexplicable pain, like actually what we need is presence and allies, right?
Yeah.
We don't actually want a cognitive explanation. Like that doesn't actually furnish soul deep comfort.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
There's
yeah,
a time and a place for an apologetic theodicy wrestling, but it's
yeah,
not in the depths of pain.
No.
In that moment, no apologetics have value.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think, yeah, there, I don't want to discount all forms of theodicy. However, I think one of Job's main contributions to that whole discussion is really insisting on the epistemological limitations of humans. That is, the limitations of what humans know. So it
Right.
actually kind of excuses us from needing to explain everything, because it's to
Right.
say, actually, you don't have all knowledge at your disposal. There are vast swaths of what God is doing and how he is governing his cosmos that you are not privy to by virtue of being creature. And
Mhm.
so really for you as the reader, you're pressed into a crisis of decision as much as Job. Are you willing to trust God to
Yeah.
understand what you can't rule, what you can't control?
Yeah,
Uh,
I've never been persuaded that Job is a theodicy. I mean, in the most basic sense, it could be because of the prologue showing that ontologically God is not the one making evil happen and all of that. But I think Job is. I think Job sidesteps complete. I think Job leads the reader to shelf the theodicy questions for the moment. Like other
mm,
parts of Scripture certainly speak to that, but I don't think that's Job's purpose. At least when people, I've just heard people say Job is the Bible's theodicy, and I'm like,
maybe an anti-theodicy.
yeah, yeah. If
If
anything,
by theodicy we mean defending God's ways.
right?
Like that's the whole thing God's insisting on is no, I don't actually need to defend myself to you.
Yeah,
It's a question of trust.
yeah.
Um, and actually, I think the book of Job is really unabashed about saying God is responsible for what happens in his world. So whatever intermediary agents you see involved in the prologue, Job recognizes, and you as the reader recognize, the buck stops with God. God is ultimately the one who is the divine agent standing behind all. And
Hmm.
so what you really have to grapple with, yeah, is are you do you have sort of the grittiness of faith? Do you have the spiritual infrastructure to receive good and bad from
Hmm.
God's hand and go on trusting him? That he is fundamentally good. That's not to say that we just write God off as this capricious tyrant. Um, no, God says in the divine whirlwind speeches, I think, Job, it's not your experiences that interpret my character, it's the other way around.
Right.
Actually, I'm going to point you to my world, which is emphatically good and ordered and burgeoning with life. And you need to recognize that it's actually my interpretation of things, my description of my own character and my own governance that then interprets your circumstances. Um, yeah. And then in this unforeseen act of divine mercy, while Job is interceding for his friends, everything is restored.
Hmm.
So I think it's really important to recognize that Job was satisfied while he was still on the ash heap. I think
Hmm.
that's really important. So it's not as if you get to the end of Job and it's like, oh, now God pays Job back. That's a cheap ending. And I guess the friends were right. Um,
Yeah.
I think it's much more this expression of divine generosity. Isn't it fitting that Job should be blessed by the God who does give good gifts? Isn't it fitting? And yet, not strictly necessary in a sense, in that Job's comfort didn't hinge on it. Um, but the test is over, right? Job is restored. Um, and everything about his life at the end is more than it was at the beginning. So it's escalated.
Right.
Uh, he doesn't just return to the prologue. He ends up somewhere more than where he started.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, he doesn't just get back what he lost. It's
no.
more
Yeah.
literarily. It's. I mean, obviously, the questions that people will raise are, well, but his kids died. He didn't get them back. He just got more kids back, and how and
Yeah.
that's where
He
it
doesn't
becomes a
get,
question of
yeah.
like, is it literature? Is it history? Is it that?
Yeah.
That's where those questions I think start to get muddy if we
Yeah.
miss the thrust of it. What it's saying, literary, which is he got back more than what he lost.
Yep. And I think it's verse 12, if I'm not mistaken. It even says God blessed the latter part of Job's life more than his former
Hmm.
state. And that's actually an ironic. So Bildad had said in chapter 8, he's like, listen, Job, here's what you need to do. Just repent, return to God, and then your end will be more than your beginning, using these exact same words.
Mm.
This book is brilliant. Oh, my heavens. There's so many ironies and unwitting adumbrations. Yes, you get to the end of the book and you're like, huh, Bildad, you were right, but not really, because the conditions for Job's blessing at the end are entirely different than what Bildad had imagined.
Yeah.
And yet, yeah, his end was better than his beginning.
Do you see any significance in the names of his daughters?
Oh, not particularly. I've seen some who will say that they sort of appeal to different senses. So Kezia is something aromatic. Karen Hapuch is like an eye cosmetic.
Jemima is a pancake.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's right. A pancake, which gets you that's often translated or thought of as being like a dove. So maybe there's a sound, like a cooing sound associated with that. I don't know too much of what to do with the name specifically. I think potentially in the emphasis on Job's daughters, that's a way in which his children are kind of escalated.
right.
So even though they're not doubled like his possessions are, in the prologue, the focus was much more on the sons who host the banquets. And here you have these daughters who get a lot of press for a very short prose outro.
Yeah,
There's
the
a lot
sons
of
don't even get
given to these
named.
daughters.
This is one
Yeah.
of the times where the women are named and the men aren't. Which
Yeah.
is
So they're
strange.
named, they're beautiful, and they get an inheritance. And all of those things are striking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is kind of one of the puzzling bits of the outro, I think, of that prologue.
Well,
but
that's
yeah.
the book of Job, folks. Thanks for
Yeah,
tuning.
sorry, that was not very quick.
You now know everything there is to know about Job. So Ellie did the work, and now you just sit back and no. There's hopefully my goal is hopefully this discussion gets people interested to go back and go, wait a minute, I don't remember it that way, and to go reread it.
Yes.
and
Yes.
and have a framework through which to read it. That's the goal more than anything, giving people a framework, maybe pointing them away from unhelpful readings. What would you, if you had to give, like, let's wrap this part up and then we'll do some questions if you have time, that
Yeah.
reader or viewers have submitted. But if you had to give a warning or two about how to misread Job and what to avoid or how to
Yeah.
misinterpret it, what are some things you might tell people?
Yeah, yeah. I would say, oh, that's a really good question. A couple things come to mind. One is that it's really easy when people start to kind of distill the message of Job. It's so easy to start trying to assign a reason for Job's suffering. Like really quickly, you can get to this move of like, oh, well, God was trying to refine Job's fear of God, or this was pedagogical, it was instructive suffering. And actually, the book is insisting that this, from our vantage point, is unfair.
Right.
Like Job does not deserve what has happened to him. And I think we just have to keep insisting on that because we so want explanations that we're very quick to slide into that territory. Not just in engaging with the book, but engaging with people around us. So that would be one caution, just because it's so we're so apt to do that. Another might be that when you see the word Satan in chapters 1 and 2, that can create a lot of metaphysical questions about God's divine assembly that can just sort of stall any reading of the book of Job at that point.
Yeah.
So I've done a couple of Job intensives where I've taught the book in 2 weeks for groups of students. And what I've asked them to do in both cases is to come with 50 questions, having read the entire book of Job to the first day of class. And a very large proportion of those questions had to do with that scene. Like, are God and Satan talking about me that way all the time? And these sorts of things. And I would say that those are not the questions that the text is primarily trying to answer. As much as possible, when I try to read the Bible well, I want to read along the grain of the text. I want to try to ask questions after the text as I follow where it's going. And sort of lean my weight in places that are commensurate with where the text is putting weight.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would say, yeah, from the perspective of the book of Job, the Satan is really a plot kickstart. And what Job is trying to grapple with is, oh, it feels like God has Sataned me. He actually says that twice. He says it in chapter 16 and in 30. What do you do when it feels like God is your adversary and is attacking you? That doesn't mean God is. It's not.
Right.
Not to say that's how you're meant to interpret what's happening to Job, but you really are meant to wrestle with this relationship between God and Job. And yeah, so just don't get entirely sort of what I could see as a sidetrack by getting stuck in lots of questions about the divine assembly and how that works.
People get bogged down in the demonology and the angelology and
I just don't think that's where the book's primarily trying to go. And read the whole thing is another. I know it's super tempting just to read the first 2 chapters of prose and then skip to the end where God speaks.
Right.
But yeah, I really encourage persevering. Read through the whole book. And let it have its effect on you and listen carefully. If God's been listening carefully the whole time, you may have a better chance of understanding what God says if you've been listening carefully.
Nice. I love that's great advice. So let's do this. Do you have a few more minutes?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to come back in the next episode and we're going to go through the questions that viewers have asked. I announced that Ellie was coming on YouTube and on Facebook and on Instagram, and people submitted a lot of questions. And so we're going to go through together and I'm going to ask her the questions and she will rapid fire answer them. So that will be in the next episode. So stay tuned and don't go anywhere. Come back. So like I said, this is the first episode. We're going to do some Q&A in the next episode. It's just going to be the questions that you sent in on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, and Ellie's going to answer those. So stick around for that. But that'll do it for now. Thanks to Ellie for coming on the channel, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time back here at Disciple Dojo. As always, keep training.